I want to bring in my guest in studio now as well. I'm joined by the former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, international affairs analyst Dan Perry. Thanks for being with us in studio. During Netanyahu's visit to the United States, a ceasefire deal was brought up on multiple occasions with multiple officials, mainly being the two top contenders for U.S. president. Vice President Kamala Harris says she would, quote, not be silent about the tragedy in Gaza. A statement that Netanyahu was not too happy to hear, nor Harris's opponent, Donald Trump. After he himself met with Netanyahu, Trump said Harris had a, quote, terrible and insulting meeting with Netanyahu, and her ineptness will greatly prolong the war and delay the hostage release. Well, back here in Israel, there are thousands of protesters attending the weekly rally at Hostages Square in Tel Aviv, demanding Netanyahu reach a deal now.
The main message is to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the longer you wait and the more hostages are dying, Nicole.
Pierre, we certainly hear all of that noise happening right there behind you. Thank you for that update from the field. We see here in the streets of Tel Aviv, and there's other protests also happening around the country, I do want to add, the pain that these family members and many of the Israeli citizens are bringing to the streets. But how does this relate to the international scale? Netanyahu just had a visit to the United States. He met with Joe Biden, the current U.S. president, the two contenders to take him over as U.S. president. But what actually does it play if the U.S. even has any say in this sort of a deal right now?
The U.S. has enormous leverage on Israel. Israel can't continue the war without munitions supplied by the U.S. I mean, not really. Israel would be facing a global economic boycott if not for the U.S. veto at the UN Security Council, or at least the threats of one. So, yeah, U.S. has leverage, but doesn't really want to use that leverage because, it will be a very dangerous move to publicly force Israel into a position that seems to compromise its security, and it would invite attacks on Israel, which the U.S. maybe would then have to somehow be involved with. So U.S. doesn't want to use that leverage. However, despite what Trump said, where he said Harris's statement was insulting and whatever he said, Trump says a lot of things. But among the things that Trump said was that Netanyahu has to end the war and do it quickly and get it over with. So basically, Biden, Harris, and Trump are saying the same thing. About 70% of the Israeli people are saying the same thing. The Israeli security establishment also says the same thing. And that thing, indeed, is to implement the ceasefire proposal that Biden, on May 31st, said Israel offered Hamas, which Netanyahu did not deny, and which Hamas has now appeared to have accepted. And it's a complicated rigmarole, that three-stage proposal, but if you parse it with under the cold light of logic, what you see is, in fact, a very painful and rather dangerous acceptance of the Hamas bedrock position, which is an end to the war in exchange for the hostages. In that proposal, which Israel is said to have offered, Israel withdraws from all of Gaza. So at this point, Israel's refusing its own proposal, because Netanyahu has introduced two new demands, which are a presence along the Netzarim corridor to prevent armed Hamas from going back north from the south, and most impossibly, a permanent Israeli presence in the Philadelphia corridor, essentially the border with Egypt, based on logic that the security establishment does not agree with. To wit, that Israel's presence in that corridor is required to prevent smuggling, but the smuggling happens from underground tunnels from deep inside Egypt to deep inside Gaza, underneath the corridor. So in Israel, it's not suspicion. The assessment that Netanyahu is trying to scuttle the deal is rampant. It's not a theory that we're musing about in the studio. It's rampant that he's trying to do this. And the reason is clear. Because if the deal happens, then his government is in real danger, because the two far-right parties have threatened to bring him down, and it's credible. They would prefer permanent occupation and resettlement with Jews of Gaza. Number two, if the war ends by Netanyahu's own logic that you can't do the accounting and the reckoning over October 7th and that whole debacle as long as there's a war, that logic vanishes because there's no more war. And then a reckoning must come. And from his perspective, not enough time has passed to make people forget about the cataclysmic failure that was October 7th. Now, this is obviously a horrible thing to contemplate, but anyone who thinks that such thinking is too cynical for this prime minister does not know the man. I too, my first interview with him was in 1988, and it was rather obvious even then.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is still in the United States. He's supposed to leave in several hours from the East Coast after Shabbat ends. Let's remind our viewers it is also Saturday, and typically the Prime Minister does not travel on Shabbat. And so there are reports that he is pushing up his scheduled flight a little bit sooner to come back here because of this situation. So what exactly would that mean about the escalation possibly in the north?
I don't think the Prime Minister needs to be here in order to make a decision. I don't think, as the correspondent, as Matthias said, I don't think they'd wait for him. You know, there are phones in the world and various secure communications. Indeed, the plane they're flying, and this is the inaugural trip by the wing of Zion plane, which is Israel's version of Air Force One. There's a lot of criticism of that. It cost about $200 million to create for Netanyahu. Has secure comms. One of the arguments in favor of having such a plane dedicated for prime ministerial travel around the world was that there would be security events that would require highly secure, encrypted communications of every kind, including video, so he could actually perform his duties from the plane.
I also want to update our viewers. We're getting new information to the I24 newsroom. The death toll has now risen to 11. 11 people killed in this rocket attack on a soccer field in northern Israel in the Druze town of Majal Shams. So clearly, we are still seeing more and more happening with this unfolding event. Dan, I want to hear, before we move on to some other news, just any last thoughts about exactly what this could entail in the coming hours, specifically with an Israeli response.
Well, it could entail a far more robust bombardment of specific Hezbollah assets, including the depots in Beirut. I think they're going to be very careful to not harm Lebanese infrastructure as such, because Israel understands, the military at least certainly understands, that Lebanon could be a friend in a post-Hezbollah future. Israel has a real choice to make. If it wants to do the deal, and with all the dangers implicit in its own proposal to leave Hamas degraded but still standing in power in Gaza and get back its hostages, that's one scenario. And if it wants to do that, it's going to avoid a massive escalation in the north. They will strike back for sure, but in a way calibrated to avoid a regional war. If they don't want to do the deal and they want to create a massive distraction in the north, and also have decided that the only way to deal with this absolute outrage of Hezbollah in the north firing with near impunity at Israel is to attack with even a ground move into Lebanon, well, then there will be no deal. And that would be very bad news for the hostages, those who are still alive, and it will create, it'll really reshuffle the deck in Israel, because right now the discussion really is deal or no deal, and most people are very clearly in favor of doing a deal despite the pain of leaving Hamas somehow in Gaza. The discourse will shift completely to, you know, what are we going to do with Iraqi militias attacking, you know, the Golan border? There's a lot more that could escalate, and we should see exactly how Israel does choose to respond. Dan Perry, thank you for your analysis on all of these developing situations happening right now. Pleasure.